It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. No phone, no meetings, just me, a hammock, and the soft ripple of the lake beside my ranch. That lake has been part of my family's land for decades. I grew up swimming in it, fishing off its edge, and camping beside it almost every summer. After the past few hectic months, I needed a break, and nothing beats sleeping under the stars on your own land. I set up camp like I always do. Tarps stretched tight between two trees, small fire pits circled with stone, and a simple canvas chair where I'd sip coffee in the morning mist. My dog curled up by the fire as the sun dipped behind the hills. Not a soul in sight, or so I thought. Around noon the next day, a white SUV slowly pulled up just past a ridge. The logo on the side said something about community enforcement, which was laughable because this wasn't even part of the HOA development. I stayed seated, watching, wondering if they were lost. A woman stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, walking like she owned the place. Without introducing herself, she said I was in violation of HOA camping regulations, that I couldn't have an open flame near community water sources. I told her plainly, this was my private property. The lake was mine, the trees were mine, and the land beneath her expensive shoes? Mine. She ignored me. She pointed toward the lake and asked why I hadn't filed for temporary lake use. I actually laughed. I told her again, this wasn't shared land. I pulled out my folded copy of the property deed from my glove box, the one I always carry when camping just in case of nosy neighbors or confusion. She barely looked at it. Instead, she stepped back, took out her phone, and started filming. Then she muttered, "We'll let the authorities sort this out." I didn't think much of it at first. HOA folks like to bluff. I figured she'd leave in a huff. But an hour later, I heard tires on gravel again. This time it was a deputy sheriff's truck. Now, I've got nothing against law enforcement. I believe in doing things the right way. But when a deputy walks up to you on your own land and starts asking if you have permission to camp there, something feels off. I explained everything. I showed him the deed. I even had surveyor maps printed out, highlighting my parcel lines, clearly showing the lake within my boundaries. The deputy was polite, but confused. He said they'd received a complaint about unauthorized camping on HOA land. I asked him who filed the complaint. He pointed back up the hill, where that same woman was now standing next to two other board members, arms folded, watching like hawks. I asked the deputy if he wanted to walk the land with me. He agreed. I showed him the corner markers, the fencing, even some old family photos of us at the lake going back 30 years. He nodded, took notes, and said something I won't forget. "It sure looks like you're right, but I'll have to file a report anyway." The HOA folks didn't like that. They tried to argue with the deputy, saying they'd always treated the lake as community property, claimed they'd held events here, installed benches, put up signs for trail access. I cut in and asked one question. "Can you show me a single document that says this lake belongs to the HOA? Silence. That's when it hit me. They weren't just trying to boss me around. They genuinely believed they had the right to this land. And not because of law, but because they'd been using it for so long without anyone saying otherwise. The lake was beautiful, peaceful, and added value to nearby homes. It made sense why they wanted to claim it. But using something for years doesn't make it yours. And if they've been walking across my land, building trails, installing benches, and holding events without permission, that sounded an awful lot like trespassing. What started as a quiet camping weekend was beginning to look like something much bigger, not just a misunderstanding, but a battle over ownership, power, and truth. And I was just getting started. After the officer left, I sat by the lake for a long while, watching the breeze skim across the surface. My dog was still curled up beside me, but the peaceful feeling from earlier had vanished. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Why would the HOA be so confident about land they didn't own? Why did they show up with such entitlement? Something didn't add up. So I packed up my little camp earlier than planned and headed straight back to the ranch house. I dug out every bit of paperwork I had, property maps, survey records, deeds from when my grandfather bought the land, even the original boundary drawings from the county. Everything pointed to the same fact, The lake was fully within my property line. No easement, no shared rights, no exceptions. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I drove down to the county records office the next morning. It's not a place most folks visit unless there's a problem. The front desk clerk raised an eyebrow when I explained what I was looking for, but she was helpful. We pulled up the plats, zoning records, and anything filed by the HOA over the past 20 years. And there it was, clear as day. The HOA's designated community boundary ended over 400 feet from my lake. There wasn't a single legal document connecting them to that area. No shared usage agreement. No access rights. Nothing. But the clerk told me something else that got my attention. Several years ago, the HOA submitted an informal request to expand a public use walking trail. That proposal mentioned lake adjacency and even hinted at recreational opportunities. The proposal was denied. So they knew they didn't own the land. They knew they weren't allowed to use it. And yet, they'd still been treating it like part of their neighborhood. I remember the benches I'd seen near the lake path, weathered wood. One of them even with a plaque reading, "In memory of our beloved neighbor." That wasn't just trespassing. That was establishing presence, making the area feel like it belonged to the HOA community. That kind of slow, creeping occupation doesn't happen by accident. The worst part? It had been going on for years. I started walking my land with fresh eyes. I took photos, logged GPS markers, counted how many man-made signs or structures sat within my boundary line. There were 5 trail signs, 2 trash bins with HOA stickers on them, 3 benches, and a wooden footbridge crossing a shallow stream that fed into the lake, all built without my knowledge. I hadn't noticed it before because I wasn't always there. I don't live full-time on the ranch. I visit often, especially during spring and summer, but the HOA must have figured that out. They took advantage of the gaps in my presence, and that made me furious. They didn't just wander in a few times. They claimed it, maintained it, used it to boost their own property value. Families probably thought they were enjoying a public area, not realizing they were stepping on private land every time they visited. And I didn't blame the families. I blamed the board, because they had to know. Nobody installs structures, organizes events, or puts up official signage without someone at the top signing off. So either they were pretending to have authority they didn't, or they were lying outright to their community. I needed to make this right, but I also needed to be smart about it. I didn't want to end up being painted as the angry landowner, or get dragged into a shouting match with my neighbors. This had to be handled with calm, clear proof. I called my lawyer. He listened to the story quietly, asked me a few questions, and then said something that stuck with me. They might have gotten away with this if you never came back. That hit hard. All those years I'd spent away for work, letting the place be what it was, trusting that the boundaries would be respected, and now this. We agreed on the next step, a formal cease and desist, a land survey notarized and filed, and most importantly, a letter to the HOA demanding immediate removal of all unauthorized items on my land. I wasn't just protecting my lake anymore. I was about to hold them accountable. I didn't waste time. The same week, I hired a professional surveyor to come out and mark every inch of the property line, especially around the lake. He arrived with a stack of old county maps, a high-end GPS tool, and a quiet confidence I appreciated. We spent hours walking the land together, measuring every bend, every ridge, and every spot where HOA items had mysteriously appeared. He confirmed what I already knew. My property extended well beyond the lake, wrapping around where the trail signs and benches had been placed. The survey flags told the truth. Bright orange ribbons lined the trees, like a border nobody could deny. One of them, in particular, was planted right next to a wooden bench that had clearly been there for years. Whoever built this knew it wasn't theirs, the surveyor said, shaking his head. This isn't accidental. This is planned. That was all the confirmation I needed. I documented everything. Photos, videos, GPS coordinates. I even had drone footage taken, showing just how far the HOA structures crossed onto my property. I sent it all to my lawyer. He crafted a detailed cease and desist letter that outlined every violation, backed up by the new survey results. The letter was calm, professional, and full of facts. It gave the HOA 7 days to remove all unauthorized structures and to stop using the land for any reason whatsoever. We sent it via certified mail to every board member. 3 days later, I got a call, not from the HOA president, but from their attorney. He was clearly trying to sound civil, but his tone had that passive-aggressive edge you only hear from people who know they've been caught but don't want to admit it. He said the HOA had long understood that the area was available for community use and claimed there had been a gentleman's agreement with the previous owner. I nearly laughed. There was no gentleman's agreement. My grandfather owned the ranch before me, and I know for a fact he would have never allowed that. He was a stickler for property rights. And if anyone had tried to cross that line without permission, he would have handled it on the spot. I asked the lawyer to produce any written agreement, any document, any email, even a Post-it note that mentioned shared access. He had nothing, just vague stories and hearsay. He started backpedaling fast. Then he offered a compromise. Maybe the HOA could lease the land surrounding the lake for community enjoyment. I told him I'd think about it. But really, I was just curious how far they'd go to keep hold of something that was never theirs. 2 days later, the HOA president finally reached out. She called me directly, probably thinking a phone call would smooth things over. She started off friendly, thanking me for taking the time to clarify things, but I could hear the panic under her calm voice. She said she was shocked by the survey results and claimed this was all just a misunderstanding. I didn't let her off the hook. I told her I'd been more than patient. I reminded her that I had been accused of trespassing on my own land, that the police had been called on me because she had claimed ownership she never had, that signs, benches, and even trash bins with the HOA logo had been placed without any permission. I explained that I wasn't just upset, I was done. She fell silent for a moment. Then she asked if there was any way to resolve this amicably. I said there was. Remove every single thing they placed on my land. Apologize, and never step foot past my boundary line again without written permission. By the end of the week, the benches were gone. The signs disappeared overnight. Even the trail access was blocked off. It was as if they were trying to erase all evidence that they had ever been there. But I wasn't finished watching. I installed motion-activated cameras along the path where most of the trespassing had occurred. I updated the fencing. I posted clear signs that said, "Private property, no trespassing." I even added a new one for good measure. "Smile, you're on camera." Because I didn't trust them. Not after how far they had gone, how long they had used the land like it was theirs, and how quickly they had tried to flip the story back on me. When I stood my ground, it felt like the right move. But deep down, I had a feeling they weren't going to let it go that easily. About 2 weeks after everything was removed from my land, things got quiet. Too quiet. The HOA board members weren't knocking on my door. There were no more passive-aggressive notes left in my mailbox. No police visits. And no more strangers wandering around my lake pretending it belonged to them. But quiet doesn't always mean peace. I started getting strange looks in town. Not from everyone, just from folks who lived in that HOA neighborhood. I'd be buying supplies at the hardware store, and I'd catch a whisper or a sideways glance. At the feed shop, one guy told me his wife heard I'd locked down public land, as if I just built a fence around a national park. That's when I realized something new was happening. The HOA was spinning a story. They weren't just backing off quietly. They were trying to turn the neighborhood against me. Word was spreading that I was the greedy landowner who suddenly took away their community lake. People who'd been using the trails for years thought I was the one in the wrong. Some believed I had just moved in and pushed everyone out, which couldn't be further from the truth. I've had that land longer than most of those homes have even existed, but they didn't know the full story. And the HOA wasn't going to tell it. Instead, they were playing the victim. I tried ignoring it at first. Let people talk. Let the truth speak for itself. But when I heard that the board was planning to bring up the issue at their next HOA meeting and possibly petition for rezoning, I knew I had to show up, not just to defend myself, but to set the record straight before this mess got even more out of hand. So, on a Thursday evening, I walked into the community center where the HOA held its monthly meetings. I wasn't on the agenda, But I didn't care. I brought a folder thick with documents, surveys, maps, photos, and legal statements. I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to clear the air. But as soon as I walked in, I could feel the tension. A few people recognized me. Some nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact completely. When the meeting opened for public comments, I raised my hand and calmly introduced myself. I explained who I was, how long I'd owned the ranch, and what happened in the past few weeks. I kept it simple. I told them about the deed, the county lines, the denied expansion request from the HOA years ago. I explained how I discovered the benches, the trail signs, and the footbridge, all placed without permission. I reminded them that I didn't call the cops when I saw people walking on my land. But when the HOA called the police on me while I camped by my own lake, I realized something had to change. The room got quiet. Then a man in the back, maybe in his late 60s, stood up and asked, "So, are we just not allowed to walk near the lake anymore?" I didn't smile. I didn't raise my voice. I just told him the truth. You're allowed to walk wherever your HOA tells you can walk. But if that walk takes you across my property line, then no, you're not allowed to be there anymore. A few folks looked down at their laps. Some nodded. One woman even said, "I didn't know it wasn't community land." And that's what made me angriest. Not at them, but at the board. These people had been misled. They were told this was theirs, and they believed it. I finished by saying that I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I wasn't trying to be the villain in some HOA drama. I just wanted what was rightfully mine to be respected. The board president didn't say much. She looked pale. The lawyer she brought along didn't even try to argue. The meeting ended soon after, but people came up to me afterward, some apologizing, some asking more questions. And slowly, the tide started to turn. I didn't expect everyone to like me after that, but I wasn't going to let their lies stand unchallenged. I had truth on my side, and now more people knew it. But just when I thought things were settling down, something happened the next morning that made it clear this was far from over. Early the next morning, I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, expecting the usual crisp air and birdsong. But what I saw instead made me stop in my tracks. Lying flat at the edge of my property was one of the no trespassing signs I had posted just days earlier, snapped clean off its post. Not by wind or weather. This was deliberate. Someone had ripped it down and left it there like a message. I walked over slowly, my dog right behind me, sniffing the ground. Sure enough, there were fresh boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. Not any neighbor I knew. They came in from the side closest to the HOA trail access. Someone had crossed my property line during the night. I checked the rest of the signs and markers. 2 more were gone, just vanished. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was pushback. They weren't just angry about losing the lake access. Now they were testing me, seeing if I'd back down, get tired, or stop watching. They didn't know me very well. I grabbed my trail cam footage and scanned through the last few hours. Around 2:38 a.m., the motion sensor kicked on. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to make out a person in a hoodie and ball cap walking along the tree line. They moved quickly, like someone who knew they shouldn't be there. They looked right at the camera once, then turned and kept going. I saved the footage, backed up twice, and sent a copy to my lawyer. He called me within the hour and said, "We're past courtesy. It's time for enforcement." By that afternoon, I had a sheriff's deputy out at the ranch taking a report. He watched the footage and nodded. "This isn't new for us," he said. "We've had a few complaints from folks living on the edge of that HOA. Seems like they have a history of pushing property lines." That made me pause. A history? He explained that mine wasn't the first case. A farmer a few miles down had a similar issue a couple years back. The HOA tried claiming a drainage path as shared space, ended up in court, and they lost. So this wasn't just about my lake. This was a pattern. I asked him what could be done. He said we could post the footage publicly, or even install new fencing with permanent surveillance signs. People tend to behave when they know they're being watched, he added. So that's what I did. By the end of the weekend, I had new signs installed, metal ones bolted into heavy-duty posts. I added 2 more cameras, both with night vision and backup battery packs. I even posted one photo from footage on a community board downtown, captioned, "Caught on private property. Criminal trespass. Smile for the camera." Some folks called it petty. Others said it was the only way to get through to people who only respect force. I didn't care about opinions. I cared about boundaries. But things didn't stop there. A few days later, I got a call from a local reporter. She'd heard conflicting stories about the lake and wanted to know if I'd be willing to give my side. I hesitated at first, not sure if it would help or make things worse. But then I figured, if the HOA had been controlling the narrative all this time, maybe it was time someone told the real one. So I agreed to meet her at the ranch. She came with a small camera crew and asked questions while we walked the trail. I showed her where the benches used to be, where the trail crossed the boundary line, the sign that had been ripped down, the survey markers. She didn't interrupt much, just nodded, took notes, and asked to explain how it all started. I told her about the night the cops showed up while I was camping, how I'd built the lake dock with my grandfather years ago, how I used to fish there every summer, how the HOA had acted like I was the outsider when the truth was the other way around. She seemed surprised, even upset. When the piece aired, it was short but honest. And for once, the comments were on my side. People were angry, not at me, but at the HOA for overstepping for so long. A few neighbors even apologized to me in person afterward, saying they never knew the full story. Still, something told me the HOA wasn't done yet. They'd gone quiet again, but not for long. About a week after the news story aired, I started noticing something strange. The HOA board, once loud and overconfident, had gone completely silent. No statements, no responses, not even a letter to the editor. It was like they vanished into the shadows. But their silence wasn't peace. It was planning. That's what made me uneasy. Late one evening, I was walking the trail near the edge of my property when I spotted something new. Pink survey flags, dozens of them, planted just a few feet from where my own markers were still standing tall. My gut tightened instantly. I hadn't called in any new surveys, and my last one had been finalized and filed with the county. So who was trying to remeasure my land now? The next morning, I went straight to the county records office. I asked if any new surveys had been submitted for my land or the bordering lots. The clerk typed away, squinting at her screen, then looked up and said something I didn't expect. "Yeah, there's a preliminary application from the HOA. They're requesting a boundary review. Looks like they're challenging your eastern perimeter. They were trying to redraw the map." I stood there in disbelief. After everything, the footage, the documentation, the legal warnings, they were now going after the legal description of the land itself? I called my attorney before I even left the building. He didn't sound surprised. In fact, he'd seen HOAs pull this trick before. When they lose ground, they try to rewrite the lines legally and literally. He assured me we had more than enough to block the attempt. But he also said something important. They're not trying to win in court. They're trying to wear you down. That hit me hard, because he was right. Every move they made, every fake complaint, every midnight trespass, every false rumor, they were all little cuts, not meant to defeat me in one swing, but to chip away until I gave up out of exhaustion. But what they didn't count on was how much that lake meant to me, how deep my family roots went into that dirt. They were playing a long game, but so was I. Still, it wasn't just a legal fight anymore. I was starting to feel it in my daily life. A local contractor I'd used for years suddenly stopped returning my calls. A neighbor who used to wave every morning now looked the other way. It was clear the HOA had friends in town, or at least people they could influence. Reputation is powerful in small places, and mine was being targeted. So I did something I hadn't planned on. I hosted a community open day at the ranch. I printed flyers and handed them out around town, feed stores, coffee shops, gas stations. "Come see the truth for yourself," I wrote. I didn't name names. I didn't even mention the HOA. Just an invitation to walk the trails, fish the lake, hear the story. On the day of the event, I honestly didn't know who would show up, But by noon, cars started rolling in. Families, retirees, teenagers who just want a free snack and a reason to skip chores. They walked the paths, looked at the markers, and read the big sign I'd set up explaining everything, from the land deed to the trespassing to the footage of the ripped-down signs. And then I spoke. I stood on that dock my grandfather and I had built, and I told them the story, calmly, clearly, with no drama, no name-calling, just the truth. I saw the looks on their faces shift. Confusion turned into realization. One older man said, "I've lived next door for 12 years and had no idea the HOA didn't own that trail." A mom with 2 kids said she was going to confront the board herself. It wasn't a courtroom win, but it was something better. Clarity. People were seeing what really happened. The next day, I received a letter, not from the board, but from one of the HOA residents. A handwritten note, simple and direct. "Thank you for standing your ground. We were lied to." That single sentence reminded me why I hadn't backed down. Because when you let lies take root, they grow wild. And sometimes the only way to cut them down is by standing taller than the weeds they try to grow around you. But even after that win, something unexpected happened next. Something I didn't see coming. 2 days after the open day at my ranch, I got a knock at my door just after sunset. Not a hard knock. Not the kind that says trouble, more like someone unsure if they should even be there. I opened the door to find a man I'd never met before, maybe in his late 50s, holding a thick manila envelope. He introduced himself quietly as Tom. Said he used to be on the HOA board. Used to. He glanced over his shoulder, like he didn't want anyone to see him there. Then he looked me in the eye and said, "I think you should have this." He handed me the envelope and turned to leave. No explanation, no chit-chat. Just one sentence before he stepped off the porch. "They've been lying to all of us." I stood there a moment, confused. Then I shut the door and opened the envelope. Inside were photocopies, board meeting notes, internal emails, and diagrams. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at, but as I kept reading, it all started coming together. It was a paper trail. Proof that the HOA had known for years that the lake and the surrounding land weren't theirs. A memo from nearly 5 years ago even showed that they'd hired a private surveyor who confirmed the property line matched mine exactly. But instead of notifying members or correcting their maps, the board had chosen to bury the report. One email in particular made my blood boil. It was from the current board president to the vice president, stating, asterisk, "No need to stir panic. He's never complained before. As long as he stays quiet, we keep access." Asterisk, that was their plan. Just keep quiet, use the land, and hope I never said anything. And when I did, they flipped the script to make me the villain. I sat back and just stared at the pile of papers. This wasn't just petty behavior anymore. It was deliberate deception. They had lied to the community, knowingly trespassed, and called the cops on me when I finally stood up for myself. I called my attorney again the next morning and told him what I'd received. He asked me to bring it all in, said it could change everything if we ever ended up in court. But more importantly, he said it might finally be enough to get the county involved. See, property disputes between neighbors are one thing, but when an organization like an HOA lies to its residents and misuses land they don't own, that can lead to real consequences. Later that week, I filed a formal complaint with the county commissioner's office. I attached the documentation Tom had given me. The response was swift. Within days, county land officials scheduled a site visit. They wanted to see the property, the boundary lines, and most importantly, what the HOA had installed over the years. When they arrived, they weren't impressed with the HOA's behavior. They saw the benches bolted into trees, the wooden walkway that extended right over the creek on my side. They took photos, asked questions, and one official shook his head as he measured out distances. "This isn't even close to their jurisdiction," he said. "They've crossed the line, literally and legally." But while all this was happening, something else was bubbling up. Whispers around the neighborhood turned into murmurs. People who had once believed the board now began demanding answers. A few even emailed me directly asking for copies of the documents. I shared them, not to stir chaos, but because people deserved to know the truth. Then came the fallout. At the next HOA meeting, which I didn't attend, several residents stood up and confronted the board. I heard about it later through a friend who lived in the area. Apparently, things got heated. Voices were raised. Someone even called for a vote of no confidence against the board president. Turns out, when you lead with lies, they don't stand forever, especially when the truth is backed by receipts. The very next morning, an anonymous post appeared in the community Facebook group. It read, Asterisk, if the lake never belonged to us, why were we told it did? Why were we told to call the cops on the actual landowner? Asterisk, the comments exploded. Some still clung to old narratives, but most people were furious. Not at me, at their own leadership. They felt betrayed. And as much as I disliked drama, I couldn't help but feel a little vindicated. They finally saw the game that had been played behind their backs. But just as the tide was turning, something happened that made the entire situation spiral in a way I never expected. Just 3 days after the HOA meeting fell apart, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in a while. Construction. Not the light clatter of someone fixing a fence or trimming trees. This was heavy-duty noise. Machinery. Engines. Shouting. I grabbed my boots, threw on a jacket, and made my way to the edge of the lake, heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and dread. What I saw nearly made me laugh. A crew, unmarked trucks, no company logos, was tearing out the wooden dock the HOA had built years ago. The same dock they claimed was a community feature. The same one that sat squarely on my land. Now it was being ripped out plank by plank, boards tossed into the bed of the trailer. I didn't recognize any of the workers, but they moved with a clear sense of purpose. I called the sheriff's office, not out of panic, but to make sure this wasn't another sneak move. Turns out the county had ordered the removal. After my formal complaint and the site inspection, they decided enough was enough. The HOA was instructed to remove everything they'd illegally placed on my property, benches, trail markers, even the gravel path near the lake. And apparently, they were under a deadline to get it done before fines kicked in. It was one of those moments you don't see coming, but wish for all along. The sound of that dock being dismantled felt like music, but not everyone was happy. Later that evening, I received an email from a name I hadn't seen before, Rachel Mitchell. She introduced herself as a longtime HOA resident and said she wanted to meet. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either, just serious. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We met at a diner near the edge of town. Rachel walked in carrying a binder and a notepad. She didn't waste time. She told me she started digging into the HOA's history after the public fallout. What she found shocked even her, and she lived under their rules for over 10 years. Turns out, the misuse of my land wasn't the board's only offense. There were whispers of misused funds, shady permit requests, and even a side deal involving land access sold quietly to a third party without a vote. And it all came back to the same handful of board members. I listened carefully, realizing Rachel wasn't just another angry resident. She was organized, smart, and she wasn't looking for revenge. She wanted change, real accountability. She asked me if I'd be willing to speak at the next meeting, just to lay out my story publicly, this time with the documents. Not to shame, but to inform. I agreed, but before I could even prepare, the story took another sharp turn. A few nights later, I noticed something odd on my trail cam. Around 1 a.m., a vehicle had pulled up near the old utility gate. The footage showed 2 people in hoodies unloading something. Couldn't tell what, but they stayed out of the camera's motion range most of the time, like they knew where the blind spots were. I reviewed the footage again and again. My gut said this wasn't just random trespassing. This felt like retaliation. The next morning, I hiked to the spot, and sure enough, spray paint. Big, ugly letters across my private property signs. Slurs. Lies. Someone even scratched into one of the trees. It was personal now. Not just a dispute. Not just property lines. This was meant to rattle me. But it didn't. I reported it, of course, and updated all my cams. But I didn't retaliate. Instead, I added a sign below the vandalized one. It said, asterisk, truth doesn't fear exposure. Asterisk short. Simple, Let them know I wasn't going anywhere. Word of the vandalism spread quickly, and surprisingly, more neighbors than ever started reaching out. Some just express support, others to say they were filing formal complaints of their own. Rachel's movement was working. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was I. Still, behind all of this progress, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA board had one last card to play. They were too quiet, too composed. And people like that, when they start to lose control, often make the biggest mess in their final attempt to take it all back. And just a few days later, that final attempt came, wrapped in a letter that could change everything. The letter showed up in a plain envelope. No return address, no official seal, just my name, handwritten in blocky letters. It was slipped under my door sometime during the night. That alone was enough to make me cautious. I opened it slowly, expecting more threats, maybe more fake complaints. But what I found inside wasn't what I expected at all. It was a cease and desist order, a formal letter, drafted by a law firm I'd never heard of, accusing me of defamation, harassment, and interference with community interests. It claimed I was spreading false information about the HOA, inciting division among residents, and damaging the reputation of the board members. They even demanded that I publicly retract all previous statements and cease further publication or discussion of internal HOA matters. And the wildest part? They were threatening to sue me for damages, specifically listing an absurd number that didn't even make sense for a local community dispute. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the pages. It felt like a bad movie. These people had trespassed on my land, lied to their residents, called the cops on me without cause, and I was the one being accused of wrongdoing? But then it hit me they were scared. This wasn't about law. It was intimidation. Plain and simple. They knew their grip on the community was slipping, and their last hope was to scare me into silence. They were hoping I'd fold, that I'd retreat, and let them patch up their image before the full truth came out. But they didn't realize how far things had come. I called my attorney, emailed him the letter, and by that afternoon, he confirmed what I already suspected. It's legal-sounding nonsense, he said. They haven't filed anything. It's just a warning letter meant to shake you. He told me exactly what I needed to do. Nothing. Don't respond, don't react, and definitely don't back down. Instead, he suggested we go one step further. File a formal motion with the county, demanding a full investigation into the HOA's finances and land usage practices. Use everything we had, Tom's documents, Rachel's findings, and now this intimidation letter, to show a pattern. So that's exactly what we did. Meanwhile, Rachel organized a community forum, something outside of official HOA channels, so neighbors could speak freely without fear of retribution. We held it at the local community hall, and to our surprise, over 60 people showed up, not just angry residents, but quiet ones, the ones who had been watching, waiting, unsure who to believe. We set up a projector, laid out every piece of evidence we had, and walked through the timeline. The fake signs, the vandalism, the misused funds, the illegal construction, the fake complaints filed against me, and finally the letter, proof they were now trying to bully residents into silence. One by one, people stood up and shared their stories. A single mom talked about being fined for having her trash bin in the wrong spot, while her neighbor, a board member, was never cited for anything. A retired veteran admitted he'd paid for a trail maintenance fee for years, but never saw a single repair made. And another woman, shaking with nerves, told us how she was harassed into silence after questioning a board decision on a fence line. It was no longer just about me. The HOA had turned a quiet community into a place where fear and favoritism ruled. And now, that curtain was being pulled back. By the end of the night, a group of residents proposed forming a temporary oversight committee, not to take over the HOA, but to monitor it, to gather evidence, to vote, to start taking real control back. And surprisingly, almost everyone agreed, but the tension wasn't gone. Not yet, because just as things started moving in the right direction, another strange thing happened. That law firm that had sent me the letter, turns out they weren't real HOA counsel. Someone had hired them privately, without board approval. And when a few residents confronted the president about it, He stormed out of the meeting entirely. That's when it all started unraveling fast. The board, once united and smug, began cracking under pressure. Whispers of internal arguments leaked out, board members blaming each other for bad decisions. Even the treasurer supposedly resigned quietly and moved out of town. Still, we all knew they had one more meeting scheduled, a final attempt to explain themselves, to regain control, or maybe to admit what they had done. And I had every intention of sitting in the front row, with every piece of evidence ready, for the moment they finally faced the truth they tried so hard to bury.